Thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. I respect you all as fellow nerds who are here gathered on a Thursday night to talk about the law. So I'm used to talking with my own fellow New Testament scholars about the law because it's the sort of thing that we get into. But then anytime I want to talk about it with anybody else, they're like, why are we talking about this? This is what you voluntarily choose to study this? So I'm grateful for y'all to give up your time to be here to do that. My thesis is simple. I mean, parts of it are not surprising, but then bits of it will sound a bit different than maybe some of you have heard it. But my basic position to talk about with Jesus and the law is that some of the paradigms that we've inherited, either through Sunday school or certain theological, within certain kind of theological readings of Scripture, certain paradigms of just reading the law in the New Testament are based on misreadings of certain texts. And so my basic position is kind of simple, that Jesus kept the law, didn't abrogate the law, expected his disciples to keep it, and that even within the early church, they decided that disciples, Jewish and Gentile, would continue to keep Torah as the thing that marked them out as believers, and that even Paul didn't abrogate the law, and that there's certain misreadings of certain Pauline passages that have governed the misreading of Paul, and then have actually been retrojected into a misreading of certain gospel passages. That's a lot, to do in one time. I won't get through all of that right now, but we'll just kind of get through some through bits and pieces in the Gospels. I teach a lot at the university at Houston Christian University, where I teach undergrads. And so I'm used to teaching in Sunday school. I'm used to teaching in a church setting. And so my own routine is to stop every kind of 10, 15 minutes or so just to kind of pause, make sure people are tracking, pause for questions. So I'm going to do that here as well, so we don't have to save all of our Q&A for the last 15 minutes or so that we don't have to do that. And so I thought the first thing that might be helpful to do is to begin with a couple of paradigms, and I'll kind of stop and see if y'all have heard of these before. So oftentimes when you're interpreting a text, or really any act of communication, a given paradigm or a given presupposition will just form how you interpret that text, right? Or inform how you interpret that given communicative event, right? All communication depends upon presuppositions that are unstated, right? All communication depends upon unstated premises that inform the meaning of that interpretation, right? So for example, if I say, right, the memorial will be held at 7 p.m. on September the 11th, what am I probably communicating to you? Yeah, probably a memorial mourning or commemorating the lost victims of, particularly 9/11, right? Except, of course, if I had said that in the year 2000, right, that could not have been the interpretation that you'd come to. In other words, the one thing you all thought it meant would have been an impossible meaning if I had said it 12 months prior, right, in the year 2000 rather than 2001, right? That's just because all communication depends upon unspoken premises that are shared between members of a given culture who say it, right? And the same thing, that's just how words and language work, right? The same thing happens with really all communicative events. So for example, if I walk up to you and go like this, there's a reason that you intuitively stuck out your fist and did the same thing, right? Even though that's a greeting that is relatively new in human history, right? Usually, if you do this 100 years ago, you're going to flinch because you think I'm about to hit you, right? This is not a normal greeting, right? Sorry, we can leave you hanging, sorry. That's because even this is a communicative act in which your interpretation of it is based on a presupposition that you only know because we're members of the same culture, right? And not all cultures share the same presuppositions about, right, actions or sayings, right? Now the big problem is that we can do these things, like I can do the fist bump with you or say the thing about 9/11, because we're all members of, even though we're all different cultures in a big sense, we're broadly members of one kind of monoculture here in the US, roughly the same age, and so we have lots of the same things, except then that would actually break down pretty quick, right? There's a lot of stuff that you know as, 20-year-olds that I just don't know by virtue of just even that sliver of a difference. I'm 38. There's like literally memes and music and stuff you guys know that I don't know. And you have inside jokes that I would actually not understand, right? I have a 5-year-old, I have a 7-year-old son, his school, he's a 7-year-old, his school banned the use of 6-7 before I had heard of it. I didn't know it. He was like, my school banned 6-7. I was like, what? Is that like a new drink? I didn't know what it was. My point is that like that's how quick it happens. I'm 38, he's 7. Imagine 2,000 years. Imagine 2,000 years. So all of a sudden we're reading a 2,000-year-old text, different language, different culture across the globe, all sorts of unspoken premises that the characters, the people in the Bible, share that we don't share. And so we're always at risk of imposing on that text or on that idea a given thing that's maybe just not there, right? So oftentimes we come to a text with a presupposition about, well, we all know X, Y, Z about this text or this character or whatever, when really in the text itself it may not be working that way at all. So let's start with one example. We often talk about this particular word. Raise your hand if you've heard this word before. Legalism. What do you mean by it when you say or hear, even if you've never said it, if you've heard legalism, what do you typically hear or think about that?
It's about earning your salvation.
Yeah, earning your salvation. Good.
The Pharisees were guilty of it.
Yeah, Pharisees were guilty of it, and obviously you already all know the Pharisees are the bad guys, right? What do we know about the Pharisees? Besides the fact that they're legalistic, right?
They're just very strict to the law to the point where it couldn't compete on their life.
Perfect. We nailed them all. Earning their salvation. I forgot what you said.
I said the Pharisees.
Pharisees, they're legalistic. You know, Pharisees are strict, that sort of thing, right? Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, so we have this belief that legalism is basically what characterizes Jews and Judaism, and particularly the Pharisees, right? Pharisees are sort of like a microcosm of Jews and Judaism, such that, they're legalistic, such that really they're kind of representative of Jews and Judaism, and they thought you could earn your salvation by a scrupulous keeping of the law, that sort of thing. I didn't know what y'all say, but I made a guess. I wrote it this way. It's typically an insult. No one ever says it positively, right? I mean, no one's ever like, hey, you look really legalistic today, you know, and they mean it nicely. Like, it's always an insult, right? And it suggests that Jews or Judaism, right, believe that they could earn their salvation or a place in heaven by a scrupulous sort of merit-earning law-keeping that typically focused on externals and rules. The interesting thing about this view is it's so widespread, both in churches and used to be in the academy. It's not very widespread in sort of New Testament scholarship anymore. People still argue it and think about it, but it's not really that widespread in sort of the New Testament scholarship anymore, like the Guild, the Professional Biblical Studies Guild. But it's very still widespread in the church and in the pew. And it's a great example of one of these sort of impositions that we put on the text. It's really actually probably just not there. So for example, Jews didn't think they could earn their salvation. The Pharisees didn't think they could earn their salvation. The Pharisees knew that Israel was the elect people of God who'd been chosen by God's own grace, and that they were given a sacrificial system. And what's the purpose of the sacrificial system? One of them. Yeah, to atone for their sins. In other words, like the covenant itself already has a built-in system to help make up for their transgressions. So in other words, like Jews and Judaism, and particularly the Pharisees, already believed that they could receive atonement and grace and forgiveness through rites that God himself had ordained and told them to do. And we don't have evidence that Pharisees thought that you could earn their salvation. The other thing we often think of is that the Pharisees are quite strict. This is one of the most interesting ones because all of our evidence from this time, from Jesus' time, the word, you may have heard of this word, raise your hand if you've heard the word Second Temple Judaism, or the Judaism of this period, right? So all the written evidence of late Second Temple Judaism states explicitly that the Pharisees are the most lenient group, known not for their scrupulousness, but for their laxity. Which actually makes sense, because the other thing we know about the Pharisees, according to Josephus, is that they were very popular among the masses. Which then, that makes sense. How do you think you become popular with the masses? Not by making the law harder to do, but by making it easier to do. And so the only extant evidence we have about the Pharisees from this late Second Temple period is that they were known for their leniency, not for their strictness. The mistake comes from reading a Josephus, first-century Jewish historian, who says this. He says, now the Pharisees were the most scrupulous of the sect, scrupulous readers of the law, It goes on. Now, the interesting thing about that is that we've taken the word scrupulous, or strict, and taken it to mean strict in terms of their conclusions. But what Josephus means is the Pharisees are the most strict in terms of their interpretation, i.e., they're the closest readers of the law, not that they come up with the strictest interpretations of it. So, let me give you an example. You guys have taken, you're all students. You've all read a syllabus. Do you all have an attendance policy in your syllabuses? What's an attendance policy? How many classes can you miss before you automatically fail?
0.
You can't miss any class. You have to have perfect attendance, or else you automatically fail a class. This is everybody in this university?
For some courses.
Wow, I was like, good gosh, man, that's incredible.
Courses are like that, yeah.
It's 0 before you start.
Okay, penalties, but not automatic fail. Okay.
State for an education major.
Okay, great. Okay, so at HCU, if it's an elective or whatever, you're permitted to miss 7 without automatically failing. You could still get dinged on your grade, but you're not going to automatically. So if the syllabus said, if you miss 7 classes, you automatically fail. All right, that's what the syllabus says. If you miss 7 classes, you automatically fail. Now, my student missed 10. So I said, all right, you got an F. And what could this student respond?
Miss exclusively 7.
This student could say, I don't fail. I didn't miss 7. I missed 10. Well, what's going on here? What did that student do? Read the syllabus very closely, but not to make it harder on himself, to make it easier for himself. In other words, found a loophole by a close reading of it, which is exactly what the Essenes describe the Pharisees as doing. They scrutinize for loopholes. It's exactly what they say, that these were those who seek the easy interpretation. They scrutinize for loopholes and they find weaknesses. In other words, they were known for their close readings of the text, but not to come to hard conclusions, to come from the perspective of the Essenes, to come to easy ones, right? Well, precisely. That's why the lawyers are always associated with the Pharisees. They are lawyers. Yeah, that's exactly right. The word is nomikoi, the lawyers, the law scholars. Yeah, which is what they were. They're law scholars. Now, all I have to say is that all of a sudden we've got like, hey, Jews and Judaism actually aren't that legalistic or legalistic at all, and the Pharisees are actually known for their leniency. And then all of a sudden, that's like changes the dynamic of Jesus' relationship or discourse with the Pharisees. It's not sort of lax Jesus going up against super strict Pharisees. It's two different guys, Jesus and the Pharisees, having just different interpretations of Torah and then coming to loggerheads about what does it mean to actually keep this or not. And more often than not, Jesus critiques the Pharisees precisely for that, for their laxity, not for their he never criticizes them for legalism, criticizes them for transgression. In other words, the explicit and repeated criticism that Jesus has of the Pharisees is not, hey, you guys are doing too scrupulous stuff over here. His exclusive criticism of the Pharisees is transgression. You guys break the law. You don't actually keep it. Just ironic, given what we, right? Okay, so that's legalism. And then I'll explain sort of like why these paradigms matter for our interpretation of the gospel. Another one's compassionless exclusivism. This idea is that some scholars have said, okay, well, the law talks about ritual purity law. If you've ever read Leviticus, you'll hear a lot about like ritual impurity or ritual purity. That you can become impure if you do this or you do that or you touch this or touch that or eat this or eat that or whatever, right? And some scholars have thought, oh, okay, well, ritual purity, it really kind of like creates like creates like a stratification of society, so that those who are pure are sort of, the insiders of society, and those who become impure, they're on the outside. And so people who take it that way, they make ritual purity out to be this sort of like cold, compassionless, rock, hard, icy thing that then Jesus comes to break because he's super compassionate. And so what I've said here is this paradigm of compassionless exclusivism is it describes the pursuit of purity as basically anti-compassionate, and then it frames the law and any pursuit of rituals as socially stratifying, and that those who pursue ritual purity are really just kind of compassionless and othering other people. So that, for example, the Pharisees are known for their pursuit of ritual purity, and a scholar like this who follows this paradigm would say, well, the Pharisees, they're really into ritual purity. That means that they're really into like isolationism, and they really kind of just think that everyone outside of Pharisaism is just wrong and bad and doesn't really know what they're doing. Cool? Questions through there? I'll pause for questions in 1 second. Last one is violent nationalism. This is another common paradigm within New Testament scholarship that describes Jews as sort of virulently nationalistic. And it uses nationalism, again, as sort of like as a pejorative, as an insult. And then, after having described Jews or Judaism as like super nationalistic, like only caring about their insular nation, it then thinks that law-keeping really inscribes that nationalism. So the way that works out is there's a particular scholar who describes Jews, Judaism, and Pharisees of Jesus' day as super nationalistic. And then this particular scholar said, okay, well, law-keeping really kind of bolstered or fostered that kind of nationalism. And because Jesus showed up and was against nationalism, he consequently then became against Torah observance. Because Jesus wanted to get rid of the nationalism, and because law-keeping sort of bolstered that nationalism, he got rid of Torah observance or law-keeping, right? Now, notice, this is 3 different paradigms. 3 different isms that control your interpretation of a given passage or a given dialogue with the Pharisees. So for example, if you think the issue is legalism, and you think that, well, Jews, Judaism, and the Pharisees are known for their legalism, well then, and if you think that the Gospels then depict Jesus as the solution to that, well then, how are you going to characterize Jesus? Yeah, anti-legalism, which is what? I don't know what's the anti-legalist, but it's a laxer, easier, abrogating it, or emphasizing grace over against obedience or anything like that, right? Okay. If you think ritual purity is sort of compassionless, and then you notice that, say, Jesus sees a leper, and the leper comes up to him, and the leper says, hey, could you cleanse me? And then Jesus says, you can cleanse me if you're willing. And Jesus says, I'm willing, be cleansed. And then Jesus touches him and then cleanses the guy. Well, if like ritual impurity is related to like being compassionless, and if people who really, really like ritual impurity are really like anti-compassion, well, then what does it tell you about Jesus if he touches a leper? That he's compassionate and doesn't care about ritual purity, right? That he doesn't care about ritual purity, right? Okay. Again, the nationalism one. If you think that, like, say, I don't know, the food laws, Israel's got distinctive dietary laws, right? If you think the dietary laws sort of really mark Israel out as Israel, like the dietary laws distinguish Israel as a people group, but now you're Jesus and you think, Israel doesn't need to be distinct, right? Israel shouldn't be distinct and they're not special. How would that then lead you to interpret Jesus' relationship to the food laws? Yeah, just abrogate them. Like, these don't matter anymore. These laws don't matter anymore, right? These are major paradigms that have governed the last 50 years or so of gospel scholarship. I don't think any of them are right. I think they're all wrong. But what they do is the given framework that you apply then is going to control the way you interpret a given passage, right? A given framework that you apply onto a given passage is then going to control the nature of that controversy between, say, Jesus and the Pharisees, or Jesus' relation to that given law, whether it's the dietary laws or ritual impurity or Sabbath or whatever, right? You're with me? Right? Because the idea is, right, if you've got a Play-Doh thing, whatever they call Play-Doh contraptions, and you choose a given shape, what's going to come out no matter what? Whatever shape. Whatever shape you select, the Play-Doh's coming out that shape. So if you choose legalism as the paradigm through which to interpret all of the gospel passages, well, then every single thing is going to come out as anti-legalist or whatever. Every controversy with the Pharisees is going to come out as, well, Pharisees are legalistic and Jesus isn't. And his interpretation of the law must just be whatever the opposite of legalism is, right? If it's same on down through the other paradigms. Now, the difference is that I don't think these paradigms are right, and I think there's a lot of evidence in the Gospels that show that they're not right. Then the question is, so then what is? Like, what does account for Jesus' interpretation of the law, and what does account for Jesus' sort of controversies with his interlocutors, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or just other Jews, right? So I'm going to pause there for questions for a minute, and then also take a step back to make sure we all know what we're talking about when we're talking about the law and the Pharisees before we proceed. So I'll pause there for questions.
Can you give a real quick rundown on, like, just super fast, on why the last two, like, what evidence we have for the last two also not being incorrect? You talked a little bit about legalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk just a little bit about the last two?
Yeah, definitely. So this one, it's just a non sequitur. So there's an article that's titled "Purity is to Compassion what fish is to bicycle." Purity just isn't related to compassion at all. You can pursue ritual purity and be the most compassionate person in the world. In other words, there's no necessary disjunction between ritual purity and compassion, such that it doesn't make any sense to say that, oh, those who pursue ritual impurity are therefore non-compassionate. It's just a non sequitur. You can be completely both. And also, and importantly, notice that they talk about how this particular paradigm thinks that that those who pursue ritual purity are sort of stratifying and they other people, such that the ritually pure are sort of like higher status and the ritually impure are lower status. But the important thing about impurity is that impurity can happen to anyone at any time. So ritual impurity is, anyone know what ritual impurity is? What's ritual impurity when we're talking about Leviticus or the Old Testament or the law? Yeah, not intentional. More often than not, it's not intentional. Sometimes it is, actually.
Temporary?
It's temporary.
Separates you from the temple.
Yeah, if you're in a ritually impure state, you cannot approach sacred space or sacred events, yeah?
In some places, in some cases, it's unavoidable.
Yeah, it's often unavoidable. It's not transgressive. If you're in a state of ritual impurity, you're not sinful, right? You can become impure and it's not sinful. And sometimes, in fact, you can obey a command and become ritually impure, right? The New Testament explicitly teaches that Jesus became impure. In Luke 2:22, it says that Mary approached the temple to make offering for their purification, meaning Jesus' newborn self was in a state of ritual impurity. So ritual impurity is a state in which you've contracted ritual impurity, and ritual impurity is a state in which you've contacted or shared airspace with sources of ritual impurity. The sources of ritual impurity are menstrual blood, seminal flux, certain categories of genital discharge besides semen and blood, afterbirth discharge, corpses, certain animal carcasses, and a superficial condition that's called lepra. We often translate it leprosy, but it's probably not leprosy. We don't think it's actually, now we probably don't think it's leprosy because lots of things can contract it. My leather bag can contract lepra, a wall of a house can contract lepra, your skin can contract lepra. So it's just a superficial condition that can affect certain garments or skins, basically. Whatever it is, we know it's not leprosy. It's just an accident of translation history that we translated that because the Greek word for it is lepra. Anyway, those are the sources of ritual impurity. If you contact them or share airspace with a corpse, then you become ritually impure. But you're not thereby sinful. Lots of them are temporary, unavoidable, etc. All the things y'all said. Yeah. Did you have a question?
No, it was just like it varies from their culture at the time.
Which part?
Just where they got that.
Leviticus from the point of view of Leviticus, God says it, right? These are all just things in Leviticus. God called Moses into the tent and just started saying all these things. So Leviticus is effectively a prolonged divine speech from God to Moses, to the people. Now, the cultural basis for that is that the common denominator in all those things is probably mortality. Lepra is a sign of decay, and then, of course, the loss of semen and blood, and corpses and carcasses all have a common denominator in the birth life cycle. Yeah. Questions through there? So the point is that if you contact or share any of these things, like a ritual impurity, well, then you're impure. But my point is, it's no big deal. Anybody can become impure. The most morally scrupulous high priest can become impure as easily as like the worst sinner in Israel. There's no social stratification to it, right? So if you're impure, you're just impure. And there's the same solution for everybody. Just go wash and wait till sundown of the same day and you're clean again. So there's no social stratification. That's why this one's wrong. The other one is that law-keeping didn't necessarily, it's actually just another non sequitur. Law-keeping doesn't inscribe violence. You can be a law-keeper and not be violent. Famously, Jesus teaches that, right? Like in the very same sermon. Like, hey, I didn't come to nullify the law. Don't nullify a single requirement. Also, don't be violent toward each other, right? You can be a law-keeper and it not inscribe some sort of violence, right? Law-keeping does distinguish Israel as a distinct group, but Jesus agrees with that. Jesus thinks that's good, in my view. I think that's part of the argument. Yeah. Other questions through there? I'm curious, having gone through some of these paradigms, I'm curious, because I have more material here that we can go through. So I'm curious, are there particular ideas or topics you want to jump into, or passages that you're curious about, before I just run ahead with it? Because I have a lot. I have about 29 more slides.
I mean, I think the adulterous woman is definitely one that comes to mind.
Okay. Yep. Good. Others? From John 8. Yep.
Matthew, when he's talking about upholding the law, not a letter of it shall go unfulfilled.
Okay. And Matthew 5? Yeah. Okay. Good. Others? Yeah.
I guess when Paul is told that he's allowed to eat the foods after, he's told he's allowed to eat pork when that was previously a dietary law, wasn't it?
Peter in Acts 10? Yeah.
Peter in Acts 10
Good.
was told
We'll
that
come to that. Yeah. I don't.
it's
Great. Yeah. Good. Gotcha. We'll come to that. I don't want to spoil the surprise. We'll come to that one. Okay. Great. Well, we'll go through a few more of these, and then we might get to all or some of these. Oops. Sorry. That's kind of a gross picture. I'll start with this one. This one's Matthew 19, and this is just an example of how legalism can sort of misguide you on a given passage. So, for example, this is from Matthew 19. It says, "Behold, one came to him," Jesus, "said, 'Teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may obtain eternal life?' And he said to him, 'Why are you asking me about what's good? There's only one who's good. But if you wish to enter life, keep the commandments.'" So already, this is the kind of passage that has always struck me as very interesting, where a guy comes up to Jesus and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus' response is, "Keep the commandments." Now, interestingly, if you've got sort of a legalism paradigm, the interpretation that's pretty common, both in commentaries and in pew settings that I've grown up in as well, is to say that Jesus is actually giving him an intentionally false answer. Because we know that this can't be the right answer, right? Because the right answer, that's a legalistic answer, right? This is a legalistic answer to tell someone, hey, what do I do to inherit eternal life? Keep the law. That's like a legalistic answer. And that sort of implies that, wow, this guy wants to, try to earn his salvation, and Jesus trying to show him that he can't really do it. So he's telling him, keep the commandments, giving him an impossibly high standard so that then it'll prove to him that he can't do it, right? That's a pretty common interpretation. goes back. I saw it. It's in Calvin, so it goes back at least 500 years, but it's before that as well. And it's how this passage has been preached to me. I've never heard it not preached to me that way, right? That it's a intentionally misleading answer to get the guy to realize that he actually can't do that. The interesting thing about that is, so it goes back to again about our importing assumptions. Everything about that interpretation is importing an assumption. Like, the text doesn't say any of that. The text just has Jesus straightforwardly say, hey, if you want to enter life, keep the commandments. And then when the guy's like, which ones? Jesus gives him a discrete set. And then he says, okay, well, I've kept those. Am I lacking anything? And he says, yeah, follow me. Which is interesting because notice what he says. What am I still lacking? Which means that following him, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, follow me. Following him doesn't replace keeping the commandments, it completes it. Like if he keeps the commandments but still lacks something, that means that following him is complementing commandment keeping, not replacing it, right? And yet the notion that it's replacing Torah allegiance or Torah observance, or that Jesus is giving him sort of an intentionally false answer to get him to come to the conclusion that he ought not do that, but really ought to do something else, is all stuff that you have to read into the text. It's just not there. Not there, right? Have y'all heard the interpretation that I'm going against? Have you heard any other interpretation? That's the one I grew up with. It was intentionally. The odd thing about it, too, is that it makes Jesus actually never answer the guy's question. The guy asks, what do I do to inherit eternal life? And then Jesus says, keep the commandments. And then if it's supposed to be an intentionally false answer to lead the guy to the true answer, it's odd that Jesus never gives it to him. Jesus never then goes on to complete the lesson and say, by the way, you can't do it and you need something else. He never says that. And the guy just walks away, which then leads you, if you've got this legalism or a paradigm, it leads you to conclude that Jesus just doesn't answer the guy's question. Like a guy came up to him and said, what do I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus either intentionally lied to him or just didn't give him the answer. That's an odd position to commit yourself to, right? Instead, if you just read it, like I think he's like, Jesus thinks this is the answer. Keep the commandments. Now, that raises other questions, but within the gospel itself and within Acts, and actually Paul as well, the solution is, law keeping is the thing that will characterize people, but they do that because the Spirit that's given to them equips their heart to be able to keep these righteous requirements, which is actually what Jesus teaches in Matthew as well. He teaches that the pure in heart will do these things or will see God, and heart purification is a metaphor for the transformation of the heart to equip a person to be obedient. Or another example, we saw this one. This is from Mark 1:41. This is a good example of the paradigm that kind of thinks that ritual purity is sort of compassionless, and that Jesus is sort of anti-ritual purity. Notice what it says. It says, a leper came to him, beseeching him, falling on his knees. This is from Mark 1, saying to him, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I'm willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. And he sternly warned him and immediately sent him away. He said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses commanded to you concerning your cleansing as a testimony to them. So what is this? What strikes you about this passage? Yeah, the last thing he says to him is go purify, right? That raises other questions, obviously, right? But what else strikes you from this? Sorry, I'll stop trying to move around. Yeah.
He doesn't tell him to go share what has happened. He tells him to keep it secret.
Yeah, he says don't tell anyone, except weirdly says this guy's supposed to go make an offering for a testimony. But yeah, that's odd as well. You can testify to the priest, but not to anyone else. Yeah. What else?
He sternly warned him, like this is a big deal.
Yeah, he seems kind of angry, mad about, or not angry, but stern. Stern's a good word for it. He means it. Yeah. What else? A few things should stand out as just like almost not make sense. If you can cleanse me. I am willing, be cleansed. So he touched him and he was cleansed. Now, go offer for your cleansing. yeah, what's going on with this cleansing? Why does he have to offer for his cleansing if Jesus already cleansed him? Right? That's kind of a big, right? That's raised a lot of interpretive questions. Did you have a question or comment?
Well, I was gonna say also, like, you probably wouldn't want to be around the leper or like let alone touch them.
Yeah.
Jesus' method of healing was touching him.
Yeah, Jesus touches this guy, and what we talked about earlier is like impurity is transmissible by touch. If you touch a leper, you're probably impure. The text actually doesn't say that, but it does say if you enter a leper's house, you become impure. So all the more if you touch it or touch one. And so yeah, a lot of things are interesting. So again, this is one of those good examples of a text that has been taken well beyond what it just probably means in its own context, and sort of kind of big paradigms have been built off it. So for example, if you think that the Pharisees are super into purity, right? And if you've turned purity into this thing that's sort of socially stratifying, then you've characterized the Pharisees as the people who would never be around ritual impurity, and so would never, touch a leper. But then you've got Jesus show up, and he does touch a leper, which means, on this paradigm, that he doesn't really care about ritual purity, and that he acted, out of compassion over against Pharisees or Jews who are not compassionate, right? So all of a sudden you've created this paradigm in which Jews and Pharisees are not compassionate and are too into ritual purity, and Jesus, who is compassionate, which causes him to not care about ritual impurity, right? It's an easy paradigm. And it's actually, I don't know, no offense, I love the show The Chosen, I'm glad it's around, but if you've seen this show, The Chosen, okay, this is the paradigm it takes, right? I mean, it turns Jesus' acts of healing into just these things that are like offensive to everybody, right? And it's just it turns, and they depict like sort of the Pharisees looking on at Jesus like doing certain healing acts and just getting bewildered, like I can't believe you touched that guy or whatever. Right? But a few things are remember that contracting impurity is not transgressive, so you can touch a leper and it's not a big deal. It's not. There's nothing wrong with touching a leper. There's nothing wrong with contracting impurity, right? So it's just not a big deal. And the second is that this one particular scholar, Marcus Borg, said that Jesus' act of healing the leper was an anti-Pharisaic miracle. He's called it anti-Pharisaic because he was trying to say that the Pharisees, right? They love ritual impurity, or love ritual purity, and are sort of anti-compassionate. And so Jesus, touching a leper, has an anti-Pharisaic front to it, right? And he says that to kind of create a paradigm of Jesus versus the Pharisees, and that the battlegrounds are ritual impurity, and that Jesus kind of dissolves ritual impurity, doesn't really care about it anymore, over against the Pharisees who do. When in fact, what you see is Jesus touches this guy and heals him, which is fine. You can touch people with impurity, and it's not transgressive according to Torah. But then also, it creates this question: did Jesus cleanse the guy or not? And in other words, in what sense did Jesus cleanse him, and in what sense is he still in need of cleansing? Yeah.
Not cleanse him of his sins?
Here it says he cleansed him and the leprosy left him. So the cleansing there is related to the lepra leaving his body. Yeah. So I mean, is there what's going on here? How can he cleanse the guy, but the guy still need cleansing?
Was it more just to report to the priest?
Yeah, except he says offer for your cleansing. Yeah, offer for your cleansing. Yeah.
Is it talking about Jesus physically cleansing him of whatever malaise is actually afflicting him?
Yeah.
Versus the more ritualistic,
Yeah.
I don't know, esoteric cleansing that needs to happen at the temple?
Yeah. No, I do think that's basically it. And the idea is that in Leviticus 15, there are, I'll go back to it, but Leviticus 15, the idea of cleansing is polyvalent. Sorry, I'll skip all this. I'll come back to all that. Good night. Wow. In Leviticus 15, holy moly. There you go. Okay. Cleansing is polyvalent. So in other words, in Leviticus 15, the word cleanse can just mean heal. And the word cleanse can mean ritually purify after the healing, right? So for example, if I've got like I don't know, like a raw chicken breast, and I throw it onto the counter, nothing on the counter. I don't have a cutting board down, I don't have saran wrap down or anything. I just threw a raw chicken breast on the counter. My wife sees it. What do you think she's going to say to me? Clean that off, right? So now, what if I just pick up the chicken breasts and I'm like, okay, I'm done? What is she going to say? Yeah, clean the counter. There's still whatever bacteria is on the counter, right? In other words, I removed the thing that's causing sort of the original defilement, but the residual defilement is still there, right? This is the way like cleansing works in Leviticus 15. There can be a thing, a discharge, that's causing ritual impurity, but then even when that discharge is taken care of, you're still in a state of ritual impurity. And so this is from Leviticus 15. It says, now when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. And this is the nature of the uncleanness of his discharge. It's every bed on which the person with the discharge lies becomes unclean. Everything on which he sits becomes unclean. Da da da. It goes on and on for like 12 verses. Now it says, now when the man with the discharge becomes cleansed from his discharge, then he shall count off for himself 7 days for his cleansing. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water, and he shall become clean. In other words, cleansing in Leviticus 15 is just polyvalent. You can be cleansed in the sense of remove the thing that's causing the impurity, but then still be in a state of impurity, for which you need to perform a ritual. And this is what Jesus does in Mark 1. He cleanses the guy of his lepra, and there the cleansing means he heals him. But then, he then says, all right, but you're still in a state of ritual impurity, so go to the priest for that. In other words, Jesus does what the priest can't do, which is heal him. The priests aren't equipped to heal this guy, right? But Jesus is. Jesus is empowered by his Father, etc. So like, Jesus does what the priest can't do, heal him. And then Jesus sends that guy to the priest so that the priest can do for him what Jesus can't, which is perform the rituals of ritual purification. Because you have to be a Levite to do that. Jesus isn't a Levite, right? So here is a good example of a way in which like, it's a pretty actually mundane event. I mean, mundane in the sense of as far as the law goes. It's awesome in that it shows Jesus' compassion, he cares about this guy, and his power, he heals the guy. But people have turned it into a Jesus versus the law thing. That he's doing the stuff, that on the wrong reading, they're like, oh, he's overtaken the job of the priest. He's purifying him when really that was a priestly job. Or he's anti-Pharisaic in this healing when really it's just like, there's nothing anti-Pharisaic about it, right? And in the passage itself, notice that no one critiques it. And when he touches the guy and heals him, there's no outcry. There's no priests, no Pharisees around saying like, hey, why are you doing this? It's not what, it's just not what they're crying out about. Questions through there on that one? Yeah.
I think later that same example, it says the priest is to sacrifice to them the one for his sin offering. It specifically says sin offering.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the Hebrew word is chatat, which means probably purification offering. So it's a translation issue. The verbal form of that noun is hite, which means to purify. And so the chatat is probably the purification offering. I think the confusion in translation comes from the fact that you offer that same offering both for acts of sin and for non-sinful acts. Because in both cases, what you need is purification. And in other words, purification becomes a metaphor for what you need in all cases. If you've sinned, you need to be cleansed from your sin. If you've contracted ritual impurity, well, what you need is purification. So in both cases, what you need is a purification of sorts. And so what you need is a purification offering. And so then it becomes context dependent when it means an offering because you've sinned or an offering because you need ritual purification. The word itself, though, just lexically, vocabularily, just means purification offering. Yeah, good question. Other questions? All right, so I'll back up a little bit and say that, okay, then what's, we've talked about it's not legalism, it's not compassionless exclusivism or whatever, and it's not violent nationalism. Is there a paradigm that kind of does make sense of Jesus' own, own issues or own interpretation of the law and his controversy with the Pharisees. And I think that it does. I've called it in the book, I've called it restoration eschatology. So what I think is the restoration eschatology paradigm goes like this. It's that Israel received the law, and then they were warned of punishments. Those punishments include like exile, captivity, captivity to the nations, all that sort of stuff. But then also they were assured of restoration after that punishment. That's the sequence of events in Deuteronomy 28 to 30, right? In Deuteronomy 28 to 30, Israel receives the law, but then Moses says, all right, we've received the law, we're about to enter into the land. Now, be sure that you don't violate this covenant, because if we do, that will be covenant breach, and if we breach the covenant, then we're toast, and we're going to get all the punitive discipline. So don't violate the covenant, because if we do, then we're going into exile, that sort of stuff. But then Moses says, but I know you guys will violate the covenant. You guys have been disobedient since the day I brought you out of Egypt. You've been disobedient while I've been with you, and I'm about to die. So I know you're going to be disobedient when I'm gone. And then, of course, he says, and when I die and you got the next generation coming, I know you guys are going to become disobedient. You're going to violate the covenant. You're going to receive the punitive discipline. But then, after exile, if you return to God with all your heart, etc., then God will restore you from all your captivity. He'll bring you back to the land. He'll rescue you from captivity. He'll circumcise your heart so that you'll walk in his law, that sort of thing. And so that's an implied sequence, an implied sort of narrative sequence of Israel's life that then plays out through the rest of the Old Testament. Israel's reception of the law, the warnings about what would happen if they broke it, and then they break it, and they receive the punitive discipline. But then they're promised, but you'll experience the restoration after your endurance of the punitive discipline, right? And so then that restoration that they're promised, it entails their transformation of their heart to enable their obedience to the law that God gave them. That's what Moses says in Deuteronomy 30. This is what the prophets say in the New Covenant passages, that God will transform the heart to equip you to be sort of law keepers, right? And then, of course, throughout the Old Testament, you see that, yeah, Israel did, in fact, break the covenant. They received the promised punitive discipline. And so, even at the beginning of the Gospels, Israel is still in that punitive state. They're still subject to foreign powers, spiritual powers, natural powers, whatever. They're still subject to the God-given punitive discipline, and so are in need of restoration. But then the Gospels depict John the Baptist and Jesus, of course, as the heralds and executors of this long-awaited national restoration, in which Jesus is telling them that, hey, the restoration is now, and here is how we keep Torah to characterize us as those who will participate in this promised restoration. In other words, I call this paradigm the restoration eschatology paradigm. It's not my paradigm. A scholar from 50 years ago said it as well, E.P. Sanders, and Tom Wright and others. But it's, I think, a framework that helps explain both the narrative context of the Gospels, that they open up with the fact that Jesus begins his ministry by announcing that the restoration is now here, but then also you have Jesus then teaching what it means to be a righteous Torah-keeping person, which then brings us to Matthew 5. When Jesus says, look, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it, and not a single commandment can be abolished, etc. And then he teaches from the law and teaches them how to keep it, right? It even says your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And the interesting thing about that is, again, if you've got the legalism paradigm, then you assume that Jesus is lying or giving you a false thing. You seem that not that we would ever actually say Jesus is lying, but you know what I'm saying. You would hear him saying like, oh, Jesus is giving them a false standard. He's saying that the standard is this most highly impossible standard that no one can keep, so parentheses, really you won't do that. And really you need something else, like Romans 3 or something, right? But in fact, when Jesus says your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, he doesn't think that's an impossible standard. He doesn't think that's an impossible standard because he doesn't think the Pharisees are righteous. So, like when he says your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, he thinks that's a keepable task because he thinks the Pharisees are unrighteous. And he doesn't just think it, he says it over and over again in Matthew. You guys are hypocritical, unrighteous transgressors. So the irony to me, then I'll pause again for questions. The irony to me of thinking that Jesus critiques the Pharisees for legalism is that Jesus' explicit criticism is the opposite of legalism, right? Legalism, as we said before, is someone trying to earn their salvation because they're super scrupulous, right? Jesus thinks they don't keep the law. His criticism is not that you overkeep it, it's that you don't keep it. And so when he says your righteousness got to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, he's like, which is doable because they don't do it, right? And so then the rest of Matthew 5 is, well, so here's how you keep Torah. And he then exposits what it means to be a Torah keeper in light of the commandments. And that's how I take Matthew 5. Yeah. Okay, now I'll pause there again for questions. I also don't know what time it is. Great. Are you guys tracking with what I'm saying? Y'all understand this paradigm? Yes, sir.
Kind of like he had mentioned, how would this specifically apply to like stoning the adulterous woman? Since just as I've heard that interpreted, like very specifically as overturning the law.
Yeah.
Given that he didn't, and it was explicitly commanded that they could stone her.
Yeah. Okay. There's probably three things I'd say about it outside of the fact that it's probably not original to John. But outside of the manuscript evidence, the two things I'd say are that the first one is that Jews didn't have the capacity to perform capital punishment. So this is why the Jews have to go to the Roman governor to get Jesus executed. So Jews don't actually have the capacity to do it anyway. So they already had to work around performing capital punishment themselves if they wanted to. The other thing is that the law actually requires that both parties be executed, and they only brought the woman. And so I think there is more to this passage. They're presenting Jesus as the person who is compassionate and won't condemn people because we're all in need of grace and forgiveness. So I'm not trying to nullify any of that. I think that's all great. But if in terms of the person who's asking the question, like, oh, see here he nullified the law. Well, if they are going to sort of be ticky-tacky on the law, stuff like that, then actually, no, Jesus would not have been, because they are the ones who started a false trial by only bringing the woman. The legal stipulation is that you bring both the man and the woman. So if she's caught in the act, that means the man was caught in the act too, in which case he would be executed as well. But they only brought the woman. So he's showing them that, hey, like when he says, hey, who's the one without sin? Cast the first stone. In other words, he invites them to stone her. But he knows they won't because they've all just sinned by having brought only the woman. They should have brought both parties. Yeah.
So did they have some special loophole to stone Stephen?
Oh, yeah. I mean, no, not a loophole. It's just a legal act, an illegal act. Yeah, no, it's a riot. I mean, it's a riot, yeah. They stoned Paul, too. Yeah. People break the law all the time. Yeah. Good question. Others?
Do you think that they knew, I mean, trying to get inside their mind, so the Pharisees and the people knew they were in this stage?
Great question. Did they know they were in this state of the punitive discipline?
Is that why they responded to John the Baptist?
Yes. No, precisely. In fact, so the question is, did the people know they were in this stage of the story and that restoration was on the horizon and they were waiting for it? Absolutely. Now, did every single Jew know it? I don't know, right? Well, we don't, the way we have to do history, of course, is we just have limited extant sources. We can't know what every single person on the street thought. But we can read the headlines, right? And they can give you a sense of, kind of like, I don't know, a headline on social media, or like something that's trending on social media. That doesn't mean that every person on that app thinks that, but it tells you like the direction, the trend. So the trend is, yeah, people were expecting it, they were waiting for it, and that, yeah, they responded. In fact, even says that when John the Baptist was teaching and preaching, he says all the people were in a state of expectation, wondering, is this the Messiah or not? So that when they see, the interesting thing, I mean, this actually goes back to other aspects unrelated to the law. When Jesus heals people, Jesus points to his healing as evidence that he's the guy who's here to inaugurate the restoration. In other words, the question is, all right, Jesus is here and he's announcing that the restoration's at hand. So now he's teaching the law and also doing things that prove, that restoration's at hand. But that then becomes the question. He's making a claim about himself. He's making a claim like he reads from Luke 4, and he says, the Spirit is upon me to announce the favorable year of our Lord, etc. Right from Luke 4, he reads from Isaiah 61. And then he says, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. In other words, he makes a claim about himself. He says that he is the Spirit-anointed person sent by his Father to do X, Y, Z. Well, all of a sudden, you've made a claim about yourself. You're not just saying that the restoration's here in the way that John is, right? You're saying the restoration's here and I'm the line in the sand, so get on board or not. So then the question becomes, not just is restoration here. The question is, are you the guy? Which is then what he has to point to. That's where he points to his healings as. So that then, for example, if you can think about Matthew 11. In Matthew 11, Jesus is doing his thing. He's healing people, preaching, and everything, right? And then John the Baptist gets sent to prison. John the Baptist gets sent to prison, right? So now he's in prison, and you can see why he'd be confused. Because in Isaiah 61, it said that the Spirit-anointed figure, it said the Spirit would come upon him, and he would be the one to announce the favorable year of our Lord, to comfort all those who mourn, and to release the prisoners from captivity. And John thinks, oh, Jesus, you're the guy. Like, you're the guy who's here. You're announcing the day of restoration. Prisoners set free. And then John goes into prison. And he thinks, well, this can't be right. So then, even after, again, this is Matthew 11, which means by this stage of Matthew, John the Baptist has already baptized Jesus. And yet, in Matthew 11, if you don't know it, I can pull it up. In Matthew 11, John sends two of his disciples to Jesus and says, hey, John sent us. They want to know, are you the coming one, or should we expect someone else? In other words, John's question isn't, is restoration here or not? John's question is, are you the guy or not? And what's Jesus' response? You want to know? Go and tell him what you see. The dead are raised, the blind see, lepers are cleansed, the lame walk, the deaf hear. In other words, he points to his healings as vindication of restoration's really here and that he's the one here to inaugurate it, right? So in other words, his healings are evidence of the fact that he's the guy performing the restoration, which then is interesting because then whenever you see the Pharisees or other Jews who just like don't believe Jesus' claim, when they see him heal or do something fantastic like exorcise somebody, they don't deny the work, right? Like they don't, we're used to like thinking in terms of like theism or atheism. So that if I saw a guy heal somebody and actually saw him really I know this guy was like dead, or I know this guy was paralyzed, and then I see a guy touch him and he gets up and walk, I would all of a sudden believe in a supernatural power, right? That might take me from atheism to some kind of, supernatural belief, right? But that's not the state that Jesus is operating in. They already believe in God. So when Jesus exorcises a guy or heals a guy or whatever, it's not like the Pharisees are like, oh, wow, God really does exist, right? No, they already believe that. They want to know. And they don't even deny that he did it. They're like, okay, we see you did that. What do they say? You did it by the power of Satan. They don't claim that you didn't do it. They don't claim that, oh, now we know God really exists. They claim you're casting out demons by the power of demons. And what's Jesus' response? Nope, it's by the Spirit of God. And then he says, and if I'm doing it by the Spirit of God, then you know the kingdom of God has come. In other words, restoration is really here. God's reign is really here if I'm doing it by the Spirit. So then the question becomes, is Jesus working by the Spirit or not? And that's why he calls blasphemy against the Spirit the unforgivable sin. Because you're either claiming that God put his Spirit on his Son or he did it, right? And so the controversies move in the Gospels. You'll notice they move from legal ones to, hey, why are you doing that on the Sabbath? Does the Sabbath really let you do that? Or why don't your disciples wash their hands before they eat, right? The controversies move from legal controversies, questions about law, to eventually questions about identity. Who are you? Who do you? That's why at the trial, he never gets asked a legal question. When he's on trial, they don't ask him, hey, what's your Sabbath, reasoning? Or how does ritual impurity work? The question is, are you the Son of the Blessed? Tell us now. And it's an identity question, right? Yeah. Other questions? let's do two that I know are interesting. I'll do the first one quickly, and I won't go through all the pros and cons. I'll just do a common reading. So Mark 7, and then I'll go to the Acts 10 one because you asked about the Peter thing, right? Okay. Mark 7. Okay. So the Pharisees, some of the scribes, gathered around him, and they saw that his disciples were eating their bread with impure hands, that is, unwashed hands. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but they eat their bread with impure hands? So they're raising the question, why do you guys eat with unwashed hands, right? He said to them, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts far from me. In vain they worship me, neglecting the commandment of God. You Pharisees, hold to the tradition of men. And he was also saying to them, the Pharisees, that you nicely set aside the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. And then he gives an example of a way that they invalidate the word of God. And he says, and you do this a lot, invalidating the word of God by your tradition, which you've handed down, and you do many things like that. And then he called the multitude and said to them, listen to me, all of you, understand, there's nothing outside the man which going into him can defile him, but it's the things which proceed out of him that defile the man. Leaving the house, they asked him about that parable, and he said, do you also not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach, and is eliminated, parentheses, thus he declared all foods clean. And he goes on. I assume y'all have heard this passage. Have y'all heard this passage before? Read this passage before? Heard it taught before? Common interpretation, I won't ask, I'll just assume that a common interpretation here is Jesus' nullification, abrogation of the food laws. Heard that interpretation, I take it? And it's taken to be right because the parenthetical says it, right? Thus he declared all foods clean. Before I just tell you my own thought, why is that just off the bat sort of an odd interpretation of this passage? What about the rest of this literary context suggests to you that that's an odd thing for Jesus to have done at this point?
They weren't complaining that they were eating unclean food. It was that they hadn't washed their hands.
Yeah, they weren't asking about prohibited foods. They were asking about hands, which are two different legal issues. Yeah, that's one. Yeah.
He specifically accuses them of abrogating the word of God, like
Yeah.
explicit commands of God with their own traditions, which ironically seems to be what the parenthetical.
Yeah, it's what he would do. Like, he just called them hypocrites whose hearts are far from God, who worship God in vain because they nullify the commandments for the sake of tradition. But then if Jesus is nullifying the food laws, that would then mean he's doing the very thing that he just critiqued the Pharisees for. Okay, so those are things just off the bat that kind of just seem odd. So I'm going to give you what I take to be here. The really important part is here, notice that I bolded and asterisked this. It's because this is a mistranslation of this particular phrase. And importantly, notice that thing, thus he declared, is not in the text. Doesn't say it in the Greek. Also, Greek doesn't have parentheses. So the parentheticals are just the English translator, and the phrase, thus he declared, is not in the text. All it says is, purifying all foods in Greek. So let me show you what I think is going on here. I'm just going to get to, for the sake of time, get to how I take it without going through alternatives with different pros and cons. Here's what I think. I think he's referring to the fact that there's a cleansing. The cleansing process here refers to the cleansing that happens through the digestive process. So here's what the text says, just in its most basic formula. The phrase in Mark 7:19 is just this Greek word, katharizo panta bromata, which means either he cleansed all the foods or he declared all foods clean, or that the person is cleansing all foods through the process of digestion and defecation. I think it's the latter. So that the phrase cleansing all the foods is all that Jesus says there, and the question is, what does he mean by that? I think he means that that even if there were ritual impurity on your hands, and then that ritual purity went to the food, well now, theoretically, that food could have ritual impurity on it. So the Pharisees want to protect you from ingesting ritual impurity. And so to protect your food from getting defiled, just wash your hands. So if you wash your hands, well now you've got the ritual impurity off of it, so that then when you touch your food, you won't transmit ritual impurity to the food. Jesus says, it doesn't matter, because even if there's ritual impurity on your hands and it transmits to your food, such that now your food has ritual impurity on it, and now let's say you eat that, you don't need to worry about defiling yourself because that food doesn't go into the heart, but it goes into the stomach and is eliminated, thus cleansing all the food that you've eaten, all the food that you've digested and defecated. Now, here's what he means. I think his legal logic actually depends upon understanding ritual impurity. Anyone happen to remember the sources of ritual impurity? Okay, importantly, that's too broad. The first thing he says, body fluids. That's partially right? Those are sort of our descriptors of the sources. Those are our thematic.
Discharge.
Yeah, but again, not all discharge. So you're going to have to get specific. I know nobody wants to get this specific. I'll say the ones you don't want to say. Menstrual discharge, seminal flux. Okay, got those out of the way. What are the other sources of ritual impurity? Corpses? Yeah, lepra. What did you say? Certain animal carcasses, yeah. Good. Importantly, actually, the reason I am being so particular here is because not all discharges are impure. Things that we would think are gross or are dirty are actually not impure in the Levitical sense of the word. So, if you've got a wound on your arm, it's bleeding, that blood is not defiling. It's only bloody discharge from reproductive genitalia. If you've got pus coming out of a wound, that's gross, it's dirty, it's not impure. Impure is a particular legal category. Urine, gross, dirty, not impure. Mucus, gross, dirty, not impure. Eye crust, right, goes on and on. Feces, not impure. Well, that means it's only one thing then. What is it? Pure. Feces is pure. If it's not impure, it's pure. You can only be ritually impure or pure. So feces is ritually pure. Okay? With me? Well, if you eat something that has ritual impurity on it, if it goes into your body as ritually impure and exits your body as feces, which is pure, what has your body done to it? Evidently, it's purified it. In other words, the Pharisees come up to him and say, hey, why don't you wash your hands before eating? He says, well, because the legal logic is, even if I eat this food with impure hands, that potentially defiled food goes into my heart, doesn't go into my heart, goes into my stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all the foods. In other words, he doesn't say, thus he declared all foods clean. It's still part of Jesus' speech, that the food gets purified through the process of digestion and defecation. So then the question is, and that then, my argument is, and it's not my argument, others have argued it, that Jesus doesn't nullify the food laws here. He's answering the question, the particular question they asked is, hey, why don't you guys wash your hands before you eat? And then he gives a response to that, right? Which means that, right, your English translation that puts it in parentheses is making it into a narrator's comment, right? If the English text all of a sudden says, thus he declared all foods clean, well, that's the narrator. That's the third person omniscient narrator speaking up, right? But if you translate it the way that I'm saying it should be translated, and it's still part of Jesus' speech. The food goes in, not into your heart, but into your stomach, thus cleansing all the food, thereby cleansing all the food. So it's part of Jesus' speech. So the obvious question is, all right, well, if Jesus didn't nullify the food laws, like what's going on with, did they ever get nullified, right? And this is an important part about Acts 10. So the text in Acts 10 comes from, it's from, Peter receives a vision in which he sees animals having been cleansed. So Peter's on the rooftop. Peter's one of the 12 disciples. Now this is the book of Acts, chapter 10. Peter's on the rooftop. Something like a sheet comes down with all sorts of animals in it, all sorts of creepy, crawly things. And the voice from heaven says, rise, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter responds, by no means, Lord, I've never eaten anything impure or defiled. And the voice says, what I have cleansed, you no longer call defiled. It says the voice said that 3 times, and then the sheet went up. And then interestingly, right after that, it says that Peter didn't know what the vision meant. So a common assumption is that people have thought it meant, well, here's where God has cleansed the food laws, right? God's nullified the food laws because he's made him clean, right? This is the text that says, the sheet came down and there were in it all kinds of 4-footed animals and crawling creatures of the earth and birds of the air. A voice came and said, arise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, by no means, Lord, for I've never eaten anything defiled or unclean. And the voice said, what God has cleansed, you no longer consider defiled. Now, the vision was over, and it says Peter was perplexed. He didn't know what the vision meant. And then later it says he was still reflecting on the vision. In my opinion, I mean, I've argued this, others have argued this, is not like an original argument, but I don't think this is the nullification of the food laws because it's the context of a vision. And in visions, things inside the vision don't correspond one-to-one with things outside of the vision, right? So like the same thing in Daniel 7. Daniel 7 sees a bunch of beasts coming up out of the sea to attack, but that's the vision, right? And then the vision gets interpreted, and the beasts are stand-ins for pagan kingdoms, right? So they're animals in the vision, but that doesn't mean that they stand for animals outside the vision. So the question is, what do they stand for? And the later text explicitly identifies it as the cleansing of the Gentiles. So he then goes over to Cornelius' house, and I want you to see this text right here. This is the vision when Peter says, by no means, Lord, for I've never eaten anything defiled or unclean, koinon ekatharton. And then when he gets to Cornelius' house, the Gentiles whom God had just sent him, he gets there and says, you know how uncustomary it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him, and yet God has shown me, he's referring to his own vision, God has shown me that I should not call any person defiled or unclean, koinon ekatharton. In other words, he interprets his vision with reference to the cleansing of the Gentiles, not the cleansing of the animals. Yeah. Did you have a question a minute ago? 5 minutes. Okay, great. That leaves a lot of other kind of obvious questions to ask, like, okay, so do the laws ever then get abolished? And actually, I think on my take is that Acts 15 actually doesn't. Acts 15 is the Jerusalem Council, in which their believers from the Gentiles show up, and they want to know what they need to do. And they say, all right, well, these Gentiles, some Pharisees who are believers say, well, these guys got to get circumcised and direct them to obey all the law of Moses. And then the rest of the council says, no, that's not right. And then they look at the prophetic texts, and they say that the prophetic texts see that, no, these Gentiles are going to come in, and they're going to be believers in God, and they're going to believe God as Gentiles. In other words, they stay Gentiles. So then they decide that they only become obligated to things from the law that are obligatory for Gentiles. Gentiles are not Israelites, right? And so then they say, so therefore, because they're going to be saved as Gentiles, they're only obligated to these 4 necessities, that they abstain from things contaminated by idols, abstain from the consumption of blood, and abstain from things strangled, which is a subset of the blood prohibition, and abstain from sexual immorality. Do these things and you'll do well. Goodbye. That's what the letter signs off. So in other words, the decision becomes a decision about the status of them as believers, their ethnic status. Because they're saved as Gentiles, the law only obligates them as Gentiles. And there the presupposition, of course, is that the law doesn't uniformly obligate all humans equally, which is just basic to what the Torah teaches. The Torah doesn't obligate all humans equally. The dietary laws are only given to Israel. They're not a universal mandate, right? Yeah.
So I was of the understanding that a lot of the dietary laws have, or the reason they are the way they are is largely to set Israel apart. It's also the ingraining for Israel to be set apart. And through this, isn't it also that the Gentiles, that they no longer have to be entirely apart, the Gentiles are now being included, just like with the food laws, the foods are being included, right?
Yeah, I do think that the food laws do distinguish Israel. Yeah, they set them apart. The question is, once the Gentiles are included, does Israel stop being distinct? And I think the answer is no. I think you can include the Gentiles and still have Israel as distinct, such that they can still keep the food laws with all the Gentiles included, right? So the question is, does including Gentiles mean Israel stops being distinct and did they stop doing things that distinguish them? And I think the Acts 15 answer is no. They can still be distinct and yet be inclusive, because inclusive and distinctiveness are not mutually exclusive. Right? Yeah.
I would ask, so whenever Jesus is talking and giving commandments that we still follow as Gentile Christians,
Yeah.
things like baptism, things like
Yeah.
confession, things like
Yeah.
these, well, people call them sacraments different.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Communion, obviously. What is the textual descriptor that shows us that he's giving these commandments to all of his followers versus just preaching on the law and giving these commandments to law-following, Torah-following?
Yeah, it just depends on the particular commandment. So, for example, I know time's probably up, sorry, but it just depends on the example. So for Matthew 28, it says, therefore, go, the Son of Man has received all authority in heaven and earth, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son, right? So there it's explicit. Go to the nations and baptize them, right? So he's elsewhere, though, it's a text like Galatians 5:3. Galatians 5:3 says, I testify that every person who's circumcised is obligated to keep the whole law. What he means by that is that, well, if circumcision makes you into someone who does all the commandments, not just some of the commandments, right? Over against, like 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul says, let every person remain in the condition in which he was called. So if a person is foreskinned, don't get circumcised. If you're circumcised, don't undo your circumcision. Just, he says, walk in the manner in which you were called. What matters is keeping the commandments of God. And he says, then he restates it again. Trying to find the text. He states it again. He says, remain in the condition in which you were called as a Christian. So a lot of it's presuppositional. Like the ancient Jews just already knew off the top of their head that Gentiles weren't obligated to circumcision. That's why they don't have to do it.
I think we need to cut it off here. We're out of time.
Okay.
Please thank Dr. Sloan one more time.
Yeah, no, thank you.